Hey everyone, Andrew Root back with you, and we're talking a little book discussion on When the Church Stops Working. I'm with David Wood, and David's kind of leading us through this conversation and trying to put some practical flesh on the chapters of this book. So we're going to talk about chapters 2 and 3. So, David, how's it going?
Good, and good to see you and all. So, in this chapters 2 and 3, you take a turn, it seems to me, and you begin to sort of focus on what I think this is fair to say. You see as a kind of primary posture or disposition of the church in light of living in a secular age, and the principal action that you advocate is waiting, which doesn't feel like an action at all. But there you are, and you have this interesting sort of critique of the the book of Acts in the New Testament, which all know as the Acts of the Apostles. And your critique of that is that it's wrongly named. Say something about that.
Yeah, we should have led with that. That would
Yeah,
that's the clickbait lead in title. Yeah,
right.
um, you know, I actually I'll say this because it's true and it also gets the heat off me. That was Blair. That was Blair's point. So if you're
Okay.
mad, you can send your emails to Blair. But I do agree with him. I think it is misnamed. First of all, there. God bless the canonical fathers who put this thing together, but John kind of interrupts the sequel here. The Luke Acts. It's supposed to go Luke and then Acts. These are two parts that go
Right.
together, and then
Right.
John kind of interrupts it. So we forget that these are back to back, volume one, volume two. But we do think that is the acts of God, and that the
Yeah.
primary act of the apostles, at least the first command that is really directed towards the church, is to go to Jerusalem and to wait. Like, that's the first command. And David, you and I have been around a lot of revitalization initiatives within Protestantism, and there's a lot that want to focus on Acts 2 as the kind that starts the church, and then
Right.
maybe it all the way will lead to Acts 29, which of course Acts ends in the 28th chapter, but there'll be another chapter here, and there's a kind of sense of like, let's go. And we love Pentecost because there's a lot of action to it. I mean, there's even beer. It seems like like there's at least there's a perception that some people are drunk here. We like that, but we forget that the first command before the Spirit arrives is to wait, and that does go against the grain of what it means, I think, to be a late modern person.
Is it one way to think about? I wonder if, and I think this relates to the dynamic of living in a secular age, and that is that the one thing about waiting, when we experience waiting, is that the present just seems to expand, right? It just seems to enlarge, and always, not always in ways that we feel happy about, but the moment just seems to expand in ways that we're not used to because we're used to moving in such a pace and always sort of moving from here to there. That waiting is a way in which the present becomes present. Is that a good way to put it in your mind? And I know in our reading, you and I have talked a lot about this, is that one of the things that happens in living in the time we live in is that the present contracts, it
Yeah.
gets lost, right? In that, and that's largely because the past seems increasingly irrelevant, the future seems increasingly precarious, and the present seems incredibly thin because it quickly passes into irrelevancy, or the experience of precariousness takes over. And so waiting seems to be, I think, it's a way of cutting against the grain. Would you say that of
Yeah,
all this?
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you in the sense that it feels like there's certain forms of waiting that feel like you're just stuck
Right.
too much in the moment. But I think what really is happening there is that it shows that that we don't have this capacity to stay in the moment. So what we feel frustrated about is we're trying to move forward. We're trying to move
Yeah.
into the future. Like, one of the worst places of having to wait is for a delayed flight. Because you're just wanting to move next. Board the flight, have the flight take off. Like, just move me forward. So there
Yeah.
is a certain kind of torture on of desiring to move into the future and being blocked from moving into that future. And I
Hmm.
think it is a kind of modern, I think one of the kind of framers of modernity are trying to solve this problem. Like, we should be able to continue to have your actions move forward. But there's another kind of waiting, and you mentioned in the first episode, as you talked about the different churches you were in, and you kind of flexed on us all, David, by saying that you were a pastor in Paris for a while. But I know you and I have both had the experience, not together, unfortunately, but individually, of kind of sitting in like Chartres and sitting in that
Yeah.
cathedral, or any beautiful cathedral, and you're not doing anything. And in many
Yeah.
ways, you're just waiting, but
Mhm.
that present becomes full, and it doesn't feel like, when am I going to get out of here? You just take it in as a gift, and it doesn't feel compressed. It feels quite open in a certain way, but it
Mhm.
also feels like you're just able to rest within that. And it has something to do with the beauty around you. It has something to do with the imagination, like we talked in the last episode, that just kind of descends on you from
Mhm.
those
Mhm.
windows and from, just from the art within the building. But that's a different kind of waiting. It's a waiting for an encounter, for a remembrance that you're alive, as opposed to what a lot of our experience of waiting now is like, when is this going to start? When is this traffic going
Yeah.
to loosen up? And that is a hellish kind of waiting. But we're obviously trying to talk about more of that Chartres Cathedral waiting, that in many ways we've eliminated because we've wanted to do away with the negative form of waiting. We've destroyed the other form as late modern people as well.
Yeah. And so the opening act, as you say in the book of Acts, is that of waiting, and which is perhaps another word for that is sort of this posture of receptivity, right? Of
Yeah.
ready to receive. And that I think is it there's lots of ways in which that feels again antithetical to the kind of movement that overtakes all of our lives every day, and everybody's talking. I feel like I don't have time to rest, to stop, to sort of slow down, and so there's an inevitable sense of acceleration that sort of cuts against any sense that waiting makes sense, right? Or that it's the fullness of time. It feels like the waste of time. And so you talk about, and one of the ways you talk about this is the being versus doing, that sort of ability to just be as a congregation, to be as a community, and to exist and understand the goodness of that, not as an end in itself, but as where everything flows from. And you talk about these three steps of being a church, a waiting church, if you will, or church in waiting, is the way I put it. And I think these three things are worth sort of addressing briefly. Um, that you talk about not well. The first step is being, not having, or another way you put it is humble death. I mean, that seems pretty dramatic. Say a word about that.
Well, I'm kind of into death, so
Yeah.
as people who have read my stuff for a while know, it tends to come up in a certain way. But it is this. Well, I mean, we'll put it this way: it's amazing. We talked last episode about how amazing it is to live in a world where an imagination about God is completely an option. Like
Right.
none of our ancestors could have ever imagined that you could decide to have an imagination, even a moral framework with God, or not. It's a pretty huge construction, and this is Charles Taylor's point. If you want the kind of one line of this 700-page book, is that it's a pretty amazing accomplishment, and he doesn't necessarily mean that as yay. He just means that it's something that we've constructed to create a society where God is an option, where you can go a long time not thinking about God. But what's also really fascinating, and I think is interconnected with this, is that we're a society that can go a long way, especially if you're kind of a middle class, upwardly mobile person, going a long way, not really thinking about the fact that you're going to die. That you're a creature, that there's a finite reality to this, and one of the reasons that all creatures have to wait is because they have to rest. And when God creates a reality where I don't think, I mean, I guess it depends on your own theology, but my own theological perspective is that God doesn't need to rest, but God chooses to
Mm-hmm.
rest to
Mm-hmm.
create a space for creatures to exist. And so there is a sense that you have to remember that you're finite, and I think at one level people would probably go back to the graphs from the first episode and be like, yeah, we're very aware that we could die, but it's amazing how we run from that. Like, we don't
Mm-hmm.
want to take into consideration that, yeah, that death is just part of life, and even
Right.
congregational life. Um, you know, uh, even Paul's churches that he started, they're not. they're not around in the same form, and many of them
Right.
aren't around at all. So they've found a death. They birthed something, I think, even out of
Right.
that death. But there is a lifespan even to congregational life.
And maybe that's a way that we avoid the sort of panic or this sort of the fear, if you will, and becoming slaves to that fear. I mean, you talk about this is not at all as a counsel for resignation or despair, or certainly not cynicism, but a kind of a resting in things that we cannot control. And I guess another way to put it is that, in some sense, every church has to realize from time to time certain things have to die, right?
Yeah,
They
yeah,
should die. So that's an element of, I think, of what you're saying.
yep,
And the second one you talk about is this posture of confession is another essential part of this posture, and that has an element that you contrast to apology. That confession is not apology. Confession is more vulnerable, it's more open, it's more receptive, whereas apology can be what, a little bit more defensive. How would you make that distinction?
yeah. Well, I think one. I mean, it is interesting to put it back into the being having kind of mode. Like one of the
Yeah,
reasons that we don't even want to think about death in the first one is because, well, if I'm dead, I can't have anymore, and if I can't have anymore, I don't have any meaning. You know what I mean? Well, it's a very different perspective to say I am a being, and therefore there's some freedom in even realizing that death is before me. But this, I think, this happens. Yeah, in the kind of second way too, is that apology is all like I need to get the heat off of me so that I can keep going, so I can keep moving.
okay.
So I'm not stopped from my obsessive need to have more or to reach for more. Where confession is a legitimate stopping. You have to
Mm,
stop. You have to say a wrong's been done here, or there's an incapacity or an impossibility within me or within us as a community, that we have to stop and we have to take on. I mean, we hate this as late modern people, but we have to take on some form of judgment. You know, the first one has judgment too, that you are not a god, you are a creature. And the second one is that you have to confess your limit. You have to confess wrongs that have been done. And but confession does have the possibility of really binding us together and giving us this possibility of encounter, I think, more than apology.
right. So it's a kind of one thing. It's kind of a way in which we hold open. We hold the door open and we keep it open, and it's not foreclosed. It doesn't conclude anything as much as it makes something else possible.
Mm.
Um, and that is a crucial piece of waiting. And the third one you have is this posture of gratitude, which is maybe a more positive sort of way of talking about this openness to the present, attending to real time and real people, real relationships. Say more about that gratitude as a posture.
Yeah, well, it is amazing in the midst of the acceleration.
Yeah,
You know, like, I mean, just think of it with. I'm just thinking of my 18-year-old who just got done with his senior party, his graduation party, and so one of the things that of course happens after that is you need to write all those cards of thank you for all the checks that were sent in the mail.
right.
Which David, you sent a huge one.
Yeah,
Thanks for
huge
that.
check.
Yeah,
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 nice.
yeah. But yeah, you know, and the problem with it, of course, or what you fight is that he just wants to keep moving. He just wants to move forward. The last thing he wants to do is stop and
Right,
wait and take the slow process of saying thank you. And we really are a society because of the acceleration that has a hard time. I mean, I guess this is the way consumerism works: is it wants to keep you longing for more that you never stop and realize that you've got it pretty decent. I mean, we you know we can see this right now with kind of how Americans feel. Like we see upticks in all sorts of things within the economy, and like the structural realities seem to be healthier than they have been in the last decade. And yet you ask most of us, we're like, it, this is a dumpster fire of a country. Like nothing is going right, and
right.
it's really. And I think part of it is we feel just this utter acceleration, like we have to have more, and things are slipping away from us. So gratitude puts us in that posture of waiting. I mean, when you say thank you to someone, at the very least, you have to stop to hear their response, to be in
Right.
conversation with them. And so that's really what we're getting at. I mean, ultimately, we're trying to get at this sense of encounter, which does necessitate some level of waiting for a response. And we think that's what we do in the context of worship and prayer is to wait for a response from God.
So it really, one way you put it, I think, in this chapter is that to sum up waiting, it's a way of in which we are seeking God together. So there's a kind of communal quality to what's happening that overcomes many of our sort of individual tendencies to feel like we're sort of unmoored, or there's sort of no sense of God. I think when you're located in the context of a waiting community, then you feel like I these others maybe at times even carry belief for me and or with me, right? And so there's something about that waiting that generates a kind of communal dimension, which is right there at the very beginning of the church.
Yeah.
And I think that sense of the depth participation in worship and prayer, um, not seeking growth as an end in itself, but inevitably in those occasions, growth comes individually and sometimes even in terms of the number of people. When I was thinking about your experience of waiting, as you're naming it as being central, not even a prelude to the life of the church. I think you would want to argue this is a constant demand, if you will, of the church, is that it learns how to wait in all times,
Mm-hmm.
in the midst of crisis, especially, and meaning that we're in the midst of this larger crisis. But I was thinking about this story or this experience I had, which I maybe we can end on this today, um, with philosopher Albert Borgman, who talked about focal experiences, which I think is very similar to the kind of meaning of resonance that you've already written about. We'll talk more about down the road here. And we were at a conference together with about 30 people, and we came to the end of this conference, and I said, Albert, I'd like you to sort of have the last word on what your experience of our time together. And he said, for me, this has been a focal experience. And I know you know a focal experience by it always has four qualities to it. And this is how he named them. He said, there's nowhere I would rather be. There's no one I'd rather be with. There is nothing I would rather be doing. And this I will remember well.
Hmm.
And I've always remembered that. And I feel like in the people have that experience, I think, in the context of worship. And it's not something they can create or I can fabricate as a minister up front or my choir or whatever. It's something that happens in that moment with those people that can't be repeated or fabricated or predicted, but it takes place and something has happened, not because we made it happen, but because we were receptive, open, and in this moment together. And that, if I read what you're saying, is that should be a common experience for a waiting church.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's
Absolutely. Yeah.
and that's a
It,
different kind of movement, right? It's
mm-hmm.
anyway, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There is a sense of. I think there really is a sense of movement in the context of waiting, but it's a movement. I mean, I dare say in. I mean, it's a movement to depth in many
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah.
But it also reaches out in a certain sense because it opens you to the beauty of the world in of
Yes.
these kind of encounters. The possibility of them. Even and worship becomes important because it does then send us out into the world to look for
That's
these
right.
focal experiences,
Exactly.
to
Right.
have value in these focal experiences.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, it
yeah,
doesn't
yeah.
it doesn't get left there, right? It sends you out. It has a sort of propelling quality to it.
Yeah, and it goes back to what we said in the last chapter. Like it reframes your imagination on what is good, what is full, and it's amazing how it works the other way. I mean, first of all, it's amazing how just the larger cultural reality fights against that. In many ways, doesn't want us to have these focal experiences. It wants us to be dissatisfied with everything, not to remember things well, so that we can continue just moving and consuming. But I think one of the real critiques of the church, ironically, maybe, has been that when people find themselves at moments where they feel slowed down, maybe, or at moments of kind of suffering and loss, they don't feel like the church is a place for them. They disappear, and I think becomes a major reality for a lot of pastors that feel that. Like people get moved into they find themselves in depression and they don't stop coming to church because the
Right.
idea of course is if this is going to be a good church we need people who can move fast, who can go
Right.
fast. This isn't a place where we can just dwell and really be together,
Yeah.
and feed on these focal experiences that we think the Holy Spirit really is moving through in a significant way.
And a lot of churches are just too busy to pay attention in some ways. You're right, and to
Yeah,
be attentive, I should say, in the way that you're talking about in this context of being a waiting church.
yeah, and
And
it is fascinating. Yeah,
let me just say finally too,
yeah,
as you know, as you've been saying, I retired recently, and I got this huge book of letters from people, and I was amazed at how often in those letters they spoke about moments that I don't even remember because they were just sort of part of my work. But I realized that so much happened when I thought nothing was happening. Let's make that. That's what I want to say. I guess that,
yeah,
and there's something profound about that reality. And I think a waiting church is never surprised about that reality because that's where and how God moves in the midst of
yeah.
what appears nothing is taking place.
Right. Yeah, and you can see how this then boomerangs right on the pastor. Like, what are you doing with every second of your day, as opposed to how are you creating a space where these kind of encounters can happen? It looks
Right.
like you're not doing anything, but
Yeah.
you find from those letters that those are the most profound things.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Well, thanks, David. Yeah, thanks everyone for listening to chapters 2 and 3, and some of the ramifications of those, and we'll continue to keep going. Don't pay attention if we're wearing the same shirts every time. We did these over months. We rehearsed
Months.
them. It's just we just always we only have one shirt each, so that's the issue. All right, thanks everyone.
All right. Thanks. Thanks, Andy.